in the US. That's after the Senate failed to agree on extending federal spending. Hundreds of thousands of employees are affected. But how is it being felt across the country? And what is it costing the economy? This is Inside Story.
Every few years, America plays this same dangerous game, pretending the world's largest economy can just hit pause and everything will be fine. A government shutdown, they call it. As if that word doesn't mean entire departments freezing, projects stopping mid-step, salaries delayed, confidence evaporating from markets like mist. But this time it feels different. Because while everyone's eyes are glued to Washington's chaos, the financial plumbing of the world is quietly changing underneath us. And if you hold XRP, XLM, HBAR, or XDC, you need to understand what that means, because what's coming isn't just another political mess. It's the test that separates hype from utility. Here's the thing nobody's saying on TV. A US shutdown doesn't just stop parks and passports. It shakes trust in the dollar itself. The whole global system still orbits around the US Treasury, around that illusion that the government will always pay its bills, that the machine never sleeps. But when that machine grinds to a halt, even temporarily, the people who build the next system start moving faster. The ones who've been working quietly on interoperable networks, settlement layers, and tokenized assets. The ones whose technologies can move value without political permission. And that's where these four names, XRP, XLM, HBAR, and XDC, start showing up in the margins of things that look, at first, unrelated. Government task forces, banking consortiums, interledger documents, pilot programs. They've all been circling the same idea. What if cross-border settlement didn't need a functioning government budget to keep the gears turning? What if liquidity could route itself, automatically, through digital assets that aren't bound to a single country's politics? See, during every crisis, there's a quiet rebalancing. The 2008 crash birthed Bitcoin. The pandemic accelerated central bank digital currency plans. So ask yourself, what happens when America itself becomes the variable? When traders, banks, and corporations start whispering about hedging against Washington? You think they'll just pile into gold again? Or are they looking at real-time settlement ledgers that don't go offline when Capitol Hill starts bickering? The crazy part is these networks already exist. XRP's RippleNet, BAR's Hedera Consensus Service, XLM's Stellar Network, XDC's hybrid blockchain for trade finance. They're not some white papers sitting in GitHub. They're working systems used by banks, remittance providers, and payment processors who can't afford downtime. The problem? Most retail holders don't realize that these projects are quietly preparing for the exact kind of scenario a shutdown creates. Liquidity freezes, delayed settlements, and a scramble for reliable rails. Now picture the scene. Treasury operations scaled back, payments delayed, markets jittery. You think swift messages clear smoothly when half the people who maintain the system are furloughed? You think every correspondent bank in emerging markets just keeps trusting that the dollar wires will clear tomorrow? No, they start looking for redundancy. They start looking for anything that can move value in real time without depending on a government switch being on. That's the trigger moment for digital settlement assets. Not meme coins, not speculative layer 2 projects chasing yield, but real infrastructure tokens that can bridge currencies and institutions when the old pipes get clogged. XRP and XLM were literally built for that moment, instant cross-border settlement. HBAR brings in the speed, the finality, the enterprise governance that banks love. And XDC, with its trade finance focus, is that quiet background player connecting the world's supply chains to tokenized value. So when you hear shutdown, don't think of politics, think of pressure testing. Because this is when the world's payment rails get audited by reality. Can the old system still clear trillions daily with a government asleep at the wheel? Or does the world start migrating quietly to something that doesn't break every time Congress argues? It's not a coincidence that during every debt ceiling drama, crypto liquidity spikes in certain corridors, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa. Those are regions tired of being held hostage to Washington's mood swings. You can almost feel the global South saying, "We need our own rails." And that's where these interoperable tokens slide in. Not as the next Bitcoin, but as the next infrastructure. And while the mainstream screams about crypto markets crashing or investor fear, The people inside the real system, banks, settlement houses, treasury desks, are watching closely. Because every hour the US stays shut down, every day of uncertainty, is another argument for distributed rails that keep running even when governments don't. That's the hidden signal nobody's catching. That the transition isn't happening with fireworks, it's happening with silence. So when you're holding XRP, XLM, HBAR, or XDC right now, it's not just about price charts. It's about owning a small piece of the alternative, the backup system quietly waiting for the main one to fail a stress test. You don't need a conspiracy to see it. You just need to listen to what the institutions are not saying out loud. Because every shutdown brings us 1 inch closer to a world where trust is coded, not voted on. And if you think that sounds far-fetched, just wait. The next time Washington shuts down, the markets won't just ask, when will the government reopen? They'll ask, do we still need them to move money? And when that question hits the mainstream, these 4 networks, the ones most people ignore, will already have the answer coded into their blocks. You can already picture the scramble that would unfold if this shutdown drags on longer than usual. Banks start whispering, markets turn jittery, and the people who actually move money for a living, treasury officers, compliance teams, payment providers, start making phone calls they wouldn't make otherwise. The first few days are denial. Everyone pretends it's just another political episode. But when it stretches into weeks, the tone changes. Liquidity managers start asking the kind of questions that make boardrooms uncomfortable. What's our exposure if the government can't process payments? What happens if we can't settle with our US counterparties on time? And that's where alternative rails quietly slide into the conversation. You won't see it on Bloomberg. You won't see some grand headline saying, Stellar replaces Swift, or Ripple saves the day. It doesn't happen that way. It happens through quiet memos, back-channel talks, contingency tests. Some payment corridors switch to backup routes, maybe a regional clearing partner, maybe a digital settlement pilot that's been running in the background for months. And tucked inside those pilots are the technologies most retail investors have been holding without realizing how close they already are to the real system. Think about it. When banks and remittance firms experiment with liquidity bridges, they don't use random tokens from the meme market. They test infrastructure coins, assets like XRP that can handle regulatory compliance and settlement speed, or XLM that already has integrations with major remittance companies across Africa and Latin America. Then you've got HBAR, used by corporations for internal settlements, and XDC quietly serving as the backbone for trade documents and supply chain finance. Those are the kinds of networks that get the call when legacy systems wobble. And the irony? Most of these networks were designed for exactly this kind of systemic stress. RippleNet's on-demand liquidity doesn't depend on any government's fiscal schedule. Hedera's consensus service keeps ticking with enterprise-grade reliability. Stellar's federated system doesn't ask permission. It just routes payments. XDC's hybrid design allows private transactions for institutions while still keeping interoperability open. They're like parallel railways built next to a crumbling highway, ignored by the mainstream until the main road collapses. Meanwhile, inside Washington, the same officials who publicly dismiss crypto as risky or unproven are watching the numbers. They know settlement delays cost billions. They know that if the bond market gets shaky, trust in U.S. Treasuries ripples through everything from remittances to imports. So behind the scenes, there's observation, quiet tracking of how these decentralized systems hold up under pressure. Every successful cross-border test becomes a data point. Every corporate pilot that runs smoothly adds confidence. And when confidence in the old system erodes, that's when confidence in these new rails starts to look like insurance. The shift won't be loud, but it'll be real. Maybe a mid-sized payment firm starts routing small volumes through XLM to avoid dollar delays. Maybe a logistics company begins tokenizing invoices on XDC so they can settle faster with foreign partners while banks are backed up. Maybe a fintech partner plugged into RippleNet sees record volume because it's the only network that didn't blink when treasury operations froze. Each of those stories adds up. The market notices long before the public does. And that's how transitions happen. Not with revolutions, but with necessity. When systems stop working, people find what does. When Washington shuts down, innovation doesn't. The code doesn't care about debt ceilings or partisan fights. The blockchain doesn't close because Congress can't agree on a budget. That's the whole point. These networks are apolitical. They exist precisely for moments like this. So while the world fixates on news cycles and stock tickers, those who understand the deeper plumbing of finance are watching something else. They're watching where liquidity flows when confidence dries up. They're watching which rails keep moving when everything else stalls. And increasingly, that flow leads to digital settlement networks designed years ago for a crisis nobody wanted to believe could happen. Every shutdown makes the next one more dangerous because it normalizes fragility. But every shutdown also accelerates the quiet shift toward systems that don't break. And the people who position themselves early, not by gambling on hype but by understanding utility, end up holding the assets the new world needs when the old one stops. When liquidity dries up, truth surfaces fast. Every institution that once bragged about liquidity management suddenly faces a reality check. Treasury departments discover that access to cash isn't the same as control of flow. Payments don't clear, settlement queues pile up, and international trade starts to lag. Importers can't pay exporters because their dollar wires get delayed in the middle of a government standoff. In those moments, nobody cares about ideology anymore, only what works. That's when the first calls go out to the fintechs. The quiet operators who've been experimenting with blockchain rails step forward. We can move funds instantly, they say. We have tested routes through RippleNet, Stellar Anchors, XDC hybrid nodes, heterosettlement APIs. To most people in those emergency meetings, it still sounds experimental until it isn't. Because when a $100 million payment clears in 5 seconds through a distributed ledger, the room goes silent. And the old system suddenly looks prehistoric. This is the exact type of event that stress tests every narrative. When Washington halts, the decentralized world doesn't. The old networks depend on government uptime. The new ones depend on mathematical consensus. It's not rebellion. It's resilience. While Treasury servers sit idle, validators on HBAR and XDC are still timestamping transactions across continents. Stellar Anchors in Nigeria, Brazil, and the Philippines are still routing remittances between banks and mobile wallets. XRP liquidity providers are still making markets between dollars, euros, yen, and pesos, even when the official clearinghouses freeze. In the chaos, something starts to shift. Regulators begin watching blockchain dashboards instead of market tickers. Hedge funds start looking at token volume as real liquidity indicators. And banks that once dismissed crypto as too risky start realizing it's the only network still operating at full speed. It's like watching the lights go out in a city, except a few blocks stay bright because they're running on a separate grid. XRP becomes the quiet benchmark for settlement speed. XLM, with its fiat-to-crypto on-ramps, starts handling emergency remittance traffic where banks have failed. XDC's trade finance layer becomes critical for global suppliers needing instant confirmations that their shipments are still being paid for. And BAR's enterprise-grade consensus layer starts securing back-end settlement between corporations that can't afford to wait for Washington to reopen. None of this looks like hype. There are no flashy headlines. It's not about moonshots or retail pumps. It's about survival-grade utility. And that's what changes perception more than any marketing campaign ever could. When a bank CIO realizes a blockchain just saved them from a 72-hour delay, that experience sticks. It becomes a boardroom talking point. Then it becomes a strategic pivot. By week 3 of a full-scale shutdown, markets begin to price in alternative settlement reliability. You'll see it in liquidity flows, capital quietly migrating into networks that still move. You'll see it in transaction metrics, Stellar Anchors reporting record volumes, RippleNet corridors spiking, XDC trade documents doubling, heteronodes logging corporate traffic at unusual hours. And eventually, you'll see it in sentiment. Traders noticing that these coins didn't just survive the shutdown. They became the infrastructure of continuity. Meanwhile, the mainstream media will be chasing the wrong story, arguing about when the government will reopen, while the financial system itself quietly rewires. Think tanks will call it shadow digitization. But it's not shadow anything. It's the future finally proving its worth in real time. The irony is that the U.S. shutdown, meant to be a political standoff, could become the greatest advertisement for decentralized finance ever recorded. Because it shows, in the most brutal way possible, that money doesn't stop when governments do. Value finds the fastest route. Always. And the world will remember which networks made that possible. Not the meme coins, not the hype projects, but the utility-driven assets designed to solve real bottlenecks. XRP for liquidity. XLM for global payments. HBAR for enterprise trust. XDC for trade and compliance. Each one solving a piece of the problem the old system created. So when the markets reopen and the politicians declare victory, nothing will look the same. The infrastructure that kept the world's financial pulse alive won't go back to the shadows. Banks will start to formalize what they tested under pressure. Some will announce new pilot programs. Others will quietly continue using what worked. But make no mistake, every second of that crisis became proof of concept. When the government finally wakes back up, the world has already moved on. You can feel it in the markets, in the silence between central bankers, in the numbers that don't make sense anymore. Liquidity didn't wait for politics. It found its own highway, and the people who built those highways weren't wearing suits on Capitol Hill. They were the ones coding on laptops, running nodes, watching block explorers instead of CNN. The news channels spin the reopening like a triumph. Lawmakers shake hands in front of cameras. But in the back offices of major banks, something has shifted, irreversibly. During those tense weeks when no one could move dollars across borders, the only rails that worked consistently were blockchain rails. Quietly, they'd been tested under fire. Stellar had processed remittances that never stopped flowing between Africa and Europe. XBAR's enterprise partners had kept internal transactions secure without depending on the federal payment grid. XRP corridors had continued to settle trades between banks that refused to sit on their hands. And XDC had handled trade documents and instant financing when letters of credit were delayed. Every executive in finance felt it. They saw how a network of open-source validators outperformed government infrastructure. It didn't crash, didn't freeze, didn't panic. It just worked. While Treasury departments scrambled and clearinghouses went dark, the distributed systems built by a handful of innovators kept humming through the night.